we know shame was a top line feeling for white people, but I'm curious about some of the other feelings that were alive for you inside of that experience.
Well, it's interesting that in sharing this with you, I'm like, oh, it was so small, but it was huge for me. And it was, frankly, terrifying. Thank you for joining us for our continued conversation. In the last episode of Climate Changed, Autumn spoke with Norma Wong. Norma is a native Hawaiian and Hakka Zen teacher, a lifelong resident of Hawaii, and the abbot of Anko Inn. As an 86th generation Zen master who has spent over 40 years applying Zen and indigenous values to transformational change, she offers us incredible wisdom on what it means to be a good ancestor. To ground us today, here is a brief excerpt of what Norma had to say about how we approach the future.
What arises for people when they're invited to imagine like living as if that next world was already here? What are some of the things that you notice really arise for people in that visioning?
So deep within every adult, there's still a memory of a child who could tell stories without a guide, right?
Mm.
Right? Okay, so, but it's sort of deeply buried within an adult. That said, I find that adults like to hear stories, and adults actually can be facilitated into that space of the child that is within them that
Mm.
would imagine a time and a place that is much more fruitful, that is beyond the moment of where we are right now. So it's just to say, storytelling is a powerful practice. Storytelling could happen by literally telling stories, but it can also happen by any of the arts. The aspect about it is it's a narration, a precursor to strategy and work,
Hmm.
rather than you determine what it is you want to do and then try to build a narration around that.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, tell the story of the world that your descendants, you know, 60, 75 years in advance of you, whether you have children or not. What is it that they would be doing? And imagine the world that is beyond the collapse, because we don't have to do anything at all to aid the collapse, but we do need to put in place all the things that will be needed in order to rebuild.
In this episode, Autumn will join me to talk about some of the themes and challenges that Norma raised. And if you're just joining us, welcome. It's not necessary to listen to the previous conversation before listening to this episode. In fact, listening to our reflections first will offer you a unique perspective on that previous conversation. Later in this episode, Autumn and I will also share some next steps you can take, including how you can share your own message right here on this show. All right, let's dive in.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi, Autumn.
Wow. I continue to feel so moved and delighted and compelled by that conversation with Norma. Every time I get to be in a space with Norma, it is an honor. I just want to share for the sake of our listeners so that our listeners understand my relationship with Norma Wong. She is someone whose teachings I've been following for many years. About a decade ago, I had the opportunity to go through a year-long training program with her that was rooted here in the Twin Cities, where she would come in every few months and lead a 2 to 3 day retreat with a group of organizers who were in sustained practice with her. So that was how I first encountered her work, was by being in this space where I got to lay on the ground with a bunch of other organizers and do this deep breathing and humming practice and learn about resilience and learn about this really different worldview and approach to the work of leading.
Yeah.
And I've really been paying attention to her work ever since, and I really, really trust her as a teacher.
Well, what a gift to share a conversation between you and someone who I'm just picturing you sort of like sitting at the feet of, someone who has
Yes.
been a guide to you, someone who has opened up so many new ways of thinking for you. And
Mhm.
then to share this most recent conversation you got to have with
Yes.
Norma, we got to listen in. Definitely was so grateful for the handful of places that you and she went together, places that I know are important to you, talking about styles of leadership, talking about responding to crisis. And so it makes good sense to me that she has been a real guide to you.
Yes. Yes. I'm remembering now that in January 2020, not long before the pandemic washed ashore on the on the North American
Mhm.
continent, one of the last trips that I took that year was to Hawaii. I had an opportunity to visit the encampment at Mauna Kea that was protesting the building of new satellite technology on the mountain. And it was a really profound experience to be there to receive political education from the native elders in the community about both what the mountain means, but also what the practice of encampment had been. I didn't see her there at that time, but it's just been interesting to sort of have these different windows into her work, both the receiving direct teaching from her, but then also getting to witness at least one of the political kind of manifestations of not just her work, but the way that Native Hawaiians really take seriously their responsibility to protect their land
Yeah.
and treat the land as a family member.
So beautiful. The exchange you had with Norma around this concept of indigeneity. Our organization is located on lands long stewarded by the Wabanaki. It has been incredibly important in our work to form connections and learn from some of the Wabanaki teachers, elders, practitioners here in Maine, one of whom is Sherry Mitchell, who I
Mm.
referenced in the grounding and the song that Pax composed, really in honor of Sherry and her work. Sherry Mitchell is an attorney by training, really leaning into wisdom for our times. She authored a book called Sacred Instructions: Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change.
Hmm.
In this book, the context is our climate changed world. It is this moment where colonizers are realizing the error of their ways and now turning to indigenous wisdom keepers for what they now realize was something they mistakenly hunted, frankly, and stamped out. She is trying to say, is there a way to take this moment that for her people prophesied about, that there would be this moment? The whole book is the wisdom of indigenous teaching that she is offering to this moment. At the end, she says, this is very close to the end of the book. She says, "We are now at the fork in the road. It is now up to the light-skinned people to decide which path they will choose. Will they choose the path of unity and peace, or will they stay on their current path and destroy themselves and countless others with it?"
Mm.
So I have heard Sherry's call, and then to hear Norma, kind of this complicated relationship that many of my skin color, my white skin color, have a really complicated relationship, saying I'm indigenous anywhere. For me, that's a complicated concept.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
I don't want to steal that from some, like, I don't want to do further harm. I felt like what she was getting at, it was more of a way of being. It was like an indigeneity in terms of a way of being that is
Yes,
place
there.
related, but it's not,
Mhm.
it's,
Mhm.
I don't know. Anyway, it felt really liberating to me in some way, the way that she was talking about it.
Yes, what I was really taking away from the conversation was indigeneity as worldview. And one of the things that I've really learned from her over time is this notion of understanding the time place we are in without losing sight of the much longer cycle of time that is playing out. Then I really heard her framing around indigeneity in that context of like, right, if you're not indigenous in this time place, if you're not indigenous, that is because the point of disconnection from source is so far in your past that you don't even know the story of the disconnection, right? And if you can claim indigeneity inside of this time place, it is because you are still actively fighting for the ability to remain connected to source. But it's kind of about understanding where are you in relationship to the activity of colonization,
Yeah.
which is like a really beautiful way of reframing. And I really appreciated the language that she brought in about understanding that all indigenous cultures, regardless of place or location, have these common elements of how they practice their the life ways. The differences are related to the unique geography. That was very insightful for me to receive and to just remember, right? That if we're humans on Earth, then our origins are that we have been figuring out ways to be in relationship to Earth, right?
Totally.
The origin of all human life is living on Earth, right?
Totally.
I really appreciated her helping us understand what is the current context. And then to me, where I can see the relationship between that offering that she made and this call that Sherry Mitchell is making at the end of her book is towards the end of the conversation with Norma. She says, can we set aside our constructs? Can we lay aside the grievance long enough to do the repair? What she is really inviting, and what I often hear Indigenous leaders inviting, like Sherry Mitchell, is can we actually act like human beings now? Can we move past the greed? Can we move past the individualism? But also, for those of us who have been harmed inside of these systems, can we move beyond the desire for retribution and actually collaborate with one another in the ways that collaboration is required in order for all of us, or as many of us as can, to survive? It's one of the more complex parts of the call of Indigenous leaders, not just the invitation to white people and folks who have been engaged in colonization and violence and terror as a strategy for taking. It's not just a call to white people to say, come be human with us here. It's also the call to everyone else to say, and now you have to set aside the grievance. You have to set aside the desire for retribution and the desire to reject the colonizer, which is a natural desire. We actually have to all set down these ideas in order to actually just be in relationship with one another. And that is a spiritual practice. Like that takes discipline.
Right.
That takes discipline.
Right.
That takes discipline.
Yep. And that is the space where some of the spiritual practices and some of the moral leadership that we're trying to nurture, I think does play such a huge role.
Yeah, I'm curious in the BTS Center's approach to developing spiritual leadership. How do you work with retribution? Maybe I'll say the spectrum of retribution and forgiveness. How do you work with that with your leaders?
Some of it is how do we look at and understand the history that we are a part of? Certainly understanding things like the doctrine of discovery, that Christian ideas were at the center of the why behind the claim. So I think understanding that history and then finding ways to bring that into conversation with one another as leaders and develop both kind of relationship and ritual. So we have done programming, for example, around land acknowledgements and beyond, the call to appropriately acknowledge the peoples who have stewarded the places that we are in addition to faith ancestors, in addition to more than human kin that are present in these places, to do those acknowledgements and to work towards having the present day relationships that allow mobilization for issues of sovereignty and other issues. But if we, in a congregation in Maine, are seeking to learn from our Indigenous brothers and sisters lifeways for this particular place, they need access to those places to even carry on their lifeways and know them themselves. It's really multifaceted. I did do a public apology actually to Sherry Mitchell's brother, John Bear Mitchell, at an event that we hosted. He and I spoke before I did this. I didn't do it as a surprise with him, but several religious leaders in Maine had been going through a program called Decolonizing Faith with a
Mm,
Wabanaki organization here, coming into real awareness of the centrality of this faith tradition that I am a leader of.
yeah. The centrality of this faith tradition to colonization. Yes. Mm.
Totally, totally. You know, when I walk around with an ordained title, there's a history that goes with that tradition that did real violence, real violence. So that was a super vulnerable act. And I felt like I didn't know how to do a public conversation with John Bear Mitchell without starting with the fact that I needed to offer some level of a public confession as I was becoming more and more aware of what those roots meant.
Mm,
It feels so small. It feels so small in the grand scheme of things, but it was for me a moment to model for the religious leaders in the room that maybe sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is to own that religious leadership identity and say, I'm aware, I'm sorry.
mm,
There's a Christian practice of confession. I mean, that's actually a thing that our
right.
tradition could maybe help guide us with, and maybe we need to activate it a lot more.
I mean, it's interesting, Nicole, because there's so much talk these days about
Mm,
accountability, right?
mm,
One of the things that I've really learned over years of doing social justice and movement work, working with communities, is that accountability does not happen outside of relationship.
mm.
You can't hold someone accountable that you're not in a relationship with, and you can't be accountable to someone that you're not in a relationship with, right?
Yeah.
And when we're saying accountability, apology is a part of that. It's a
Mm,
deep part of that, right? The ability to actually genuinely acknowledge harm, not just acknowledge the harm, but acknowledge I understand the impact, what the impact has been, or to the extent that I can. I'm going to name the impact, right? That is a key part of accountability. I appreciate you naming that it feels small because accountability is a term that gets weaponized a lot right now. It's become such a buzzword in community. Maybe it's easy for us to lose sight of how powerful it can be when it's done in relationship,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
When it's done in relationship, when the accountability and the apology is paving the way for the other thing that Norma Wong was really talking about in the interview, it paves the way for accompaniment. It paves the way for gotta look up the word that she used, the kako, more than us more than two as the antidote to individualism. It's accountability and apology and repair. That's what makes the way for us more than two as a part of how we actually orient going forward. Like, we can't do that unless we've actually really sat together in the grief and the heartache and the heartbreak. Our shared history includes this violence.
Right. Right.
And what do we know about time? Time's a construct, which means that that violence isn't in the past.
Right.
It's
Exact
not in the past, right? And so we have to be able to sit with it and grieve it together in order to practice the us more than two.
Yeah, I think my experience of that moment, which is part of a long journey, you use this phrase of apology to the extent that I can. That's what it was for me, was to the extent that I can. When we posture ourselves in these ways, it's really clear for me how much I don't know. It's like I'm going to say something here and I feel like actually what I'm revealing is how much I don't know. And I think that's the piece that feels like someone could come in afterwards and really highlight how much for good, for continued learning, although sometimes it's done in ways that are harsh. And yes, the hope was as an antidote to us being separate. Yeah, how do we move to a more interconnected way of being?
Mhm. Nicole, I just want to slow us down and really acknowledge that the thing you're describing that you did is something that so many leaders,
Mm,
so many people in spiritual leadership, but especially so many people who are leaders who sit inside of dominant identities feel completely immobilized and frozen around. So first, I just want to acknowledge you're telling the story of something that you did that so many people are either afraid to do or wouldn't even know the first step to take, right? And that in and of itself, it can induce fear. So I think it'd be good for us to just pause. And for our listener, if you out there, listener, you're feeling a sort of like, where would I even begin with that kind of accountability work? This moment is for you. Let's just pause and take a breath together. Oh, that felt good. Let's take 2 more. Let's take 2 more breaths together. 2 more. Here we go. Deep breath in and out. Another deep breath in and out. And I want to stay with this accountability and apology for a moment and put it in relationship to the thing that Norma Wong was talking about, reconstituting the human beingness, humanity that is not separate from everything else. What I really hear in your story is a desire to make repair that was not rooted in shame. I mean, I'm sure shame was there, but it sounds like it was actually rooted in a desire to be able to collaborate, you know? And I wonder if you could just take us a little bit into some of the emotions that were alive for you inside of that action.
Yeah.
I'm sure shame is there. We know shame is a top line feeling for white people, but I'm curious about some of the other feelings that were alive for you inside of that experience.
Well, it's interesting that in sharing this with you, I'm like, oh, it was so small, but it was huge for me. And it was frankly terrifying for anyone experience, feeling like, wow, that sounds scary. I will share that, yes, it was quite terrifying. And even just telling the story, I can feel it in my body, just the
what does it feel like in your body?
I mean, I think it's shaky. My heart rate is up, just even remembering this.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I would say is that I felt so like this was one of those God moments. I just felt really compelled.
Wow.
If John Bear was willing to be the recipient of these words, which I did want to make sure that was the case before I did this in a public way, it was like it was really not of me.
Yeah.
It's just really felt not of me. It felt like, yes, I'm going to be a conduit in this one little moment, of saying something as honest as I can say. And I thought about every word I said, and I just was trying to be as honest as I could be. Come what may. I had a real sense, the terror had all sorts of ways in which this could not be very fun for me. It obviously was not about being fun. That was not the point. But yeah, just to do the risk because you felt so compelled. And I think this is so related to spiritual leadership in a climate change world and all of what
Hell yeah.
Norma was saying to us. So she was using the language of source, which actually is not a word that I've really played with that much before. So I'm intrigued by it. But
yeah,
I feel like there's this sense of if we are tapped into source, and source reveals this grand interconnectedness, there starts to surface these things that compel us.
yeah.
My experience says open yourself to it. If your gut has this compelling thing, maybe do it rather than not do it.
Yes, yes. Well, I really appreciate too the invitation that this is a way that God, that spirit, the divinity, that the sacred is actually alive inside of us.
Yeah.
The image that comes to my mind, again, as someone who was raised in the Christian faith, is Jesus washing the feet. There's a way that humbling ourselves in the front of other people is actually deeply a part of the faith tradition.
Yeah.
Inside of individualism, the idea of humbling ourselves in front of others is frightening. But if we put that same behavior in the context of our sacred work and our communities of faith, and our communities of practice, or the watershed orientation that you were offering in one of our other conversations. If we think about that same behavior in the context of what does our bioregion require of us,
Yep.
it takes on a really different sensibility,
I love that. And I think what you just said adds clarification for me on some of what Norma was talking about in terms of leadership has to come from this attunement to bioregion, attunement to watershed, attunement to something much, much bigger than ourselves. The BTS Center in our programming, we do programs for individual leaders who are often they've been through some form of training to be a spiritual leader, and we do leadership formation, vocational formation for individuals. Of course, we imagine them as leaders of communities and in communities and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have been really exploring what communal leadership looks like. What does a group of people offering leadership in a moment look like, and how do we nurture that? So we do things like inviting teams from a congregation to a retreat where part of what they're doing actually is learning indigenous wisdom. Back to the conversation we were just having. A collective sense of call and vocation to have kind of a collective leadership. Anyway, I'm just playing with these ideas of individual leaders, communal leaders, and then this interconnected source that might feed all of this.
Yes.
I know you love leadership and think a lot about leadership and what it looks like in these times, especially these times of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wonder if there's anything that's surfacing for you.
One of the things that came through really strongly in my conversation with Norma that I'm noticing has been a theme across all of our conversations is storytelling and the role of our stories, both expanding our sense of what's possible, expanding our sense of aliveness, expanding our sense of why it is that we're even trying to survive.
Nice.
Norma has really tapped into the importance of leaders, whatever the configuration of leadership is in our community, whether it's one leader, whether it's a group of leaders, whether it's a couple of people in shared leadership, that leaders as keepers of the story.
Lovely.
As tellers of the story, leaders as the keeper of the vision that is going to guide us into a future that we would actually want to live inside of, that we could see ourselves inside of, that it's the story that helps us have a willingness to transform in the ways that we need to transform in order to be able to adapt in a resilient way towards our survival. That was one of the key takeaways for me, is that, whether I'm a leader as an organizer or a leader in a faith community or a leader in some other context, I have to understand that part of my role is to be the keeper of a beautiful story, right? The teller of a beautiful story, a story that ignites, because that was the other place that she went in the conversation. I was like, I'll be thinking about this one for years. The idea that language exists in order to express yearning. I was like, well, that's the only thought I need to have for 10 years is all I need to sit and work with that. But I really appreciate that right, we have language so we can tell story. We tell stories so that we can express yearning. Our job as leaders in this time is to really ignite the possibility of survival through telling our compelling stories. I think.
Yeah, it brings me back to reflecting on this concept of being a good ancestor in the tending to stories, both ancient stories and visionary stories, and the way in which that can guide our day-to-day choices. These stories are manifesting in how we choose to be.
Yes. What a beautiful place to land. What a beautiful place to land. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole.
This was fun. Thanks for bringing Norma to so that I could sit at Norma's feet as well.
Yes. Love to share her feet. All right. We call this part Next Steps, where imagination meets practice. It's how we carry these ideas into our shared lives, because the change we need won't happen alone. It grows in community.
Here are a few invitations inspired by our conversation. What I'd like to share with all of you listeners as a potential next step actually brings Sherry Mitchell back into this conversation. And I want to share with you her 80-10-10 rule. In the book, she talks about this 80-10-10 rule. She says, we invest 10% of our energy looking at what needs to be changed, another 10% holding back the tide of harm that has been created by our previous investments, and the final 80% creating a reality that offers compassion, safety, equality, justice, and sustainability for all. 80% towards embodying the world we want to live in.
Wow.
She really unpacked this in the event that we did with her, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But just the 80-10-10 is something that...
Right. Only 10% of your time gets to be put on railing against the things as they are.
Exactly.
Can like
you
that.
do it? Can you do it tomorrow?
That is a very delicious challenge.
There's a next step invitation.
That's great. Thank you, Nicole. And I wanted to offer a next step that's just about finding a place in your life that you could practice accompaniment in the week ahead. Think about a person or a group in your community who might need presence, not advice, but just presence. So think about a family in your community that is potentially being targeted by ICE. Think about a person in your community who has gone through recent loss of employment, or someone who maybe was a federal worker who no longer has a job. Or think about people who are struggling to be able to put food on the table and are just really being affected by what's happening economically in this time place of collapse. How can you practice accompaniment in that, showing up and coming alongside, listening, and letting the relationship between you and that person or that family, let the relationship be the first response and the relationship guide what you do next?
Beautiful.
That's what I wanted to offer. Well, listeners, we would love to hear from you about what you're discovering and what you're practicing. So please email us, podcast@thebtscenter.org. That's podcast@thebtscenter.org. Or you can leave us a voice message. We love to hear your voices. And the phone number for that is 207-200-6986. And who knows, something you share might ripple into future episodes that we record.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Climate Changed podcast.
Learn more about our guest, Norma Wong. She's the author of When No Thing Works, a Zen and indigenous perspective on resilience, shared purpose, and leadership in the time place of collapse. You can learn more about her and her work at normawong.com.
Climate Changed is a podcast from the BTS Center, cultivating spiritual leadership for a climate-changed world.
You can find transcripts, discussion guides, and now full-length video episodes with bonus material. Explore more at thebtscenter.org.
Stay connected, share this episode, and reach out anytime. We love hearing from you.
And as we close, here's a blessing for today. May you be fed, may you be watered, may you grow towards the sun, feel held in love, worthy of love.
Coming up in the next episode of Climate Changed.
Right now is just like, how can we have more choices on the menu so that the collective solution can still be individually chosen? So like, if we can have more, just like more housing available and a way to communicate risk that does not require having a master's degree in environmental science.
Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. See you next week.